Good evening. Thank you for your patience. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Errol and Selim and Afghan and Akin for helping to create this event. I appreciate it very much. I will do the best I can to speak in a way that you understand. If I speak too quickly, tell me. So I will slow down. Right? If I do not know that I am speaking too quickly, then it is all over, yes, and it won't be worth it. And thanks also to the people who are hosting here for making this possible, right? So this book that I wrote a few years ago, called Dockworker Power, Race and Activism in Durban and the San Francisco Bay Area. I appreciate that dock workers are all over the world, right? That shipping is actually a really important industry, and so hopefully after a short presentation by me, you also will find this interesting because very few people devote their thoughts to this subject. I appreciate it, but at the same time, all of us actually depend upon this industry for pretty much everything that we have in this room, the clothes you're wearing, the computers, the books, all of it moved by ship, right? All of it's probably started in one place and moved to another. And even today, even though we think of shipping as an ancient industry that has connected people before capitalism existed and hopefully after capitalism is over, right? Shipping will be there, right? I would suggest to you in many ways it is the most important industry in the world, right? And not just because I took a ferry on the Velocity in order to get here, right? Few of us think about it. Few of us work in this industry, although I appreciate that there's another guy in the room who works on this subject. But it actually is very important in our lives, but also in our world, right? I happened to become interested in this subject not because I knew this. I was interested in the subject originally when I was a graduate student 30 years ago. Because I was interested in unions, because labor unions, redistribute wealth. They basically pull wealth from those at the top downward into the working class, right? And that is, as Martin Luther King said, actually in the United States in the 1960s, the single greatest anti-poverty program that exists, right? You could depend upon the government, but you also could sort of organize yourselves in your workplaces and basically demand more money. And actually, there's a lot of evidence in many societies that works, right? It doesn't overchange the world, but it makes people less poor, right? I also was interested in race, because in my country, the United States, it's arguably the central paradox, right? That a country that has loudly and long proclaimed equality for all people, yet has practiced inequality, right? And actually, at the birth of the nation in the 1770s, slavery existed. And so at the same time, the documents that founded the nation said all people are created equal, upwards of 20% of the people were actually enslaved, right? And so that's a paradox, right? A society that proclaims equality yet practices inequality, right? Not all societies actually proclaim equality. Many don't, right? And so for me, as a young man in my 20s, these were the animating questions. It just so happened that the union that I ended up writing my dissertation and first few books on was a dock worker union. And so I became interested in the industry and then did another book on the same industry and the workers because I was drawn to the industry after I was originally interested in issues of race and class, right? But in my second book, I did a book that compares the US to South Africa because the United States is not the only country in the world that deals with these issues, right? Not every country is comparable to every other country. We say in English, you cannot compare apples and oranges, right? But arguably, South Africa and the United States are similar enough that you can do so, and I will explain more, right? So with that sort of background a little, in this book that I'm talking about today, there were multiple themes. Several chapters of the book dealt with one of these themes and several chapters with the second, etc. Right? One was how workers could use their power, not simply to improve their own economic conditions, although that is important, but also how they can use their collective power to fight for equality, right? For themselves, but also for others in their communities and their countries, right? That is what I'll talk about first. The second theme I'm not really going to talk about, but if we want to, we can in the discussion, which is how this industry experienced radical technological change, right? Many industries have also experienced and are. An academic industry is actually being transformed by technology too. It's not just blue collar or manual workers who also experience technological change, right? The third theme, which is sort of more in a way linked to the first, is how you could use your power as workers, not just to help your own society move closer to equality, but also how you could fight for people in other places that you may not know personally and may never know. Right? In other words, how I can fight for people in another country because I believe that their cause is just too. Right? And that's actually an incredible thing, because most of the time people are busy, tired, confused, bored, right? Or just sort of focused on their own lives. Right? Like the idea that you could actually fight on behalf of people in another place, I would suggest to you, is actually one of the core values of humankind, which is empathy. Even though I believe that there's a man in the United States who's from South Africa named Elon Musk who told me recently that empathy is one of the great problems in our humankind. Right? Like, I reject that, right? And I would hope that all of you do, because you're taking your time listening to me. Why compare the US and South Africa? Well, I'm going to read you a quote, the only thing I'll read from a man named Robert F. Kennedy, who was the younger brother of John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy's, the president, had been murdered by 1966, but Robert Kennedy wouldn't be murdered for 2 more years, in 1968. But in 1966, when he was a US senator from the state of New York, he visited South Africa for a week. He visited, the man who was then banned politically. He had been silenced by the state. His name was Albert Lutuli, although he had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1960. Right? But he also visited ordinary black people, for example, in a township they missed called Soweto. Right? And while he was giving a speech in Cape Town, where I actually happened to be just a few weeks ago, Kennedy spoke at a university, and he said the following: "I came here, Cape Town, because of my deep interest and affection for a land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, and then taken over by the British, and at last independent. A land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations which remain a problem to this day. A land which defined itself on a hostile frontier. A land which has tamed rich natural resources through energetic application of modern technology. A land which once imported slaves and must now struggle to wipe out the last traces of that former bondage. I refer, of course, to the United States of America." Now that's funny, actually, because he's talking in South Africa, and he's actually talking about South Africa too. Right? All those topics that he's talking about equally occurred in South Africa over the 300 or 400 year period. Right? And so if people want to talk about comparing different societies, I'm also very happy to have those conversations, including specifically in US South Africa. I am not the first or the last person to sort of notice the many similarities between these two societies. Robert Kennedy did, or his speechwriter did 50 years before I ever thought about writing this sort of book. Yeah. No offense intended, South Africa is a far way away from Turkey. I was just there. You can take a direct flight from Turkish Air, right, to multiple cities. Right? But Durban is less well known than Cape Town or Johannesburg. It is on the Indian Ocean. It's the east coast of South Africa and the east coast of Africa. The big red arrow tells us where it is. And that photograph from the 1940s is a great one. It actually still looks this way, the harbor, the port of Durban. So the mouth of the harbor here, this is the Indian Ocean here. That's a very narrow mouth. Only one ship can get through it at any one time. And actually the harbor itself is pretty small. Right? This is the old harbor area here on this sort of peninsula. And then this is the old CBD in the city. Due to containers, essentially all the work moved to the south. That's south to the left. Right? And so north is to the right. Right? And so we're looking east to west. Yeah. But that's a pretty good photo. It gives you a sense of what Durban looks like. Right? Durban was, well, for thousands of years, people had lived in this area. By the late 1700s, the indigenous peoples were known as Zulus, right, which is probably the best known ethnic group in Southern Africa, and the largest ethnic group in what is South Africa, and that whole part of the country, right. When the British got there, the Portuguese had already been in the area, but had actually chosen to basically base themselves in a city that now is called Maputo in Mozambique, but was called Lourenço Marques, if you know your sort of geography and history, right? The British basically took it as a colony. That was called Natal. Then, by the 20th century, it became part of the Republic of South Africa, right? Now it's called the province of KwaZulu-Natal, right? And it is and was the most important port in all of Africa for much of the 20th century, right? Why? Well, the short version is close to Johannesburg, which is the industrial base of South Africa, which was especially gold, right? But also exports, right? But also imports, right? And so that's a little bit of Durban. San Francisco, probably better known to people, but the image, the map on the left. So this is the mouth that gets you into San Francisco. This was nicknamed by the Spanish the Golden Gate, right? Later a bridge spans the Golden Gate, right? It was called the Golden Gate by the Spanish before then the Americans sort of took it from the Spanish, right? In the 1840s, right? And that's like a kilometer. So it's actually a much bigger mouth than Durban Harbor. And then this bay, San Francisco Bay, is actually several hundred kilometers square, right? So it's large. Right? And most of the work is actually on the east side of this peninsula because it's shielded from the ocean and the weather. So this photograph, this is 1850, of San Francisco, that would have been taken here, right? Like it gives you a sense of it. I imagine Hyder Pasha might have looked like this, I don't know, like in the same time period, right? Because that was the age of sail still. San Francisco was the most important port and the most important city in the United States and on the west coast of the Americas for over 100 years, right? It's still an important place, but in the 1920s, Los Angeles surpassed population-wise San Francisco, and it was not until containers that in the 1970s that the port of Los Angeles actually surpassed San Francisco in terms of global trade, right? And still is. Los Angeles is now like half of the cargo that comes into the U.S. comes through LA from Asia, right? Like for the most part. And so it's still important, but not as important. But historically, San Francisco is a place. Is San Francisco still important? Well, if you've heard of Max or Apple or Twitter or Uber or Airbnb, or it's shocking actually how many tech companies still are from the San Francisco Bay Area, but basically that area is still an important global source of capital, right? And culture, I would say. So anyway, that's a little about San Francisco. They share much in common, in the same way that they also share things in common here with Istanbul, right? Like, because port cities share more in common, I would suggest that Istanbul might have more in common with Durban than Istanbul might with Ankara, right? In the way that, like inland cities, not port cities, are different in a way. So like port cities are interesting because they're places where information and people and cargoes come and go, right? That might be, to use a sort of a fancy term, a sort of cosmopolitan, right? Like, because you, rather than everyone being the same in their ideas and their heritage, you have a lot of people who are different in port cities, right? Like, in that way, port cities, like I said, share things in common with other port cities, even if they're not in the same countries, right? Like, and it's often been really sort of important, not just economically, but culturally to these places, right? Like, that does not mean that everyone gets along by any means, right? But it means that you're familiar with the fact that there's difference, right? Because often in rural places, in smaller towns, everyone's alike, right? And they're less familiar with people who have different ideas, right? Like, that is not unique, right? But that is very much, we're mindful that some people don't like that. And so, for example, in 2019, the mayor of a city in northern Poland called Gdansk was murdered, right? And he was murdered by conservatives in Poland who didn't like his politics, right? The fact that he was open to immigrants, the fact that he was open to homosexuals. He was targeted, right? But he very much saw himself as a product of his place, Gdansk, which also was where the Solidarity movement actually had been born in the 1980s among shipbuilders. Right? Like, and I appreciate that Akin, right, works on shipbuilders, right? Like Gdansk is such a place. I was at the Naval Museum, I think it's called, here a month or two ago, and I pulled this quote from one of the things that being close to the sea is a symbol of civilization, so Ataturk supposedly said. Apparently he liked being near the water too. Right? Like, now, that's, again, very interesting in a lot of ways, but I'm thinking about it in terms of power, right? And when I think of power, I think of money, right? Like, I think that's what drives actually what individuals act, but also how societies often operate. Right? And I'm suggesting to you that shipping made capitalism possible. When European nations, or empires, like Spain and Portugal, later Britain and the Netherlands, started to sort of take over the world, they did it because they had the best ships in the world, right? Like, you know, and they sort of parlayed that into tremendous wealth, right? And power, right? Over the half a millennium, right? Like, even though the Ottomans were rising too, right? Really, it's a regional power, right? By the 1700s, it's Britain, right, that controls the world. Why? This little island nation. It's because they had the most powerful navy, right? Like, it was in England, in London, in 1768, that a group of people who worked aboard a ship, who wanted a raise, they wanted to make more money, took down the sails of their ship, which in English, the nautical term for taking the sails down, this is before steamships, is to strike the sail. Right? Like, and the word strike becomes the de facto word in English for all work stoppages. Right? And so the word strike has a nautical or maritime origin, and that tells us actually, I think, something about the centrality of this industry, right? To capital. Right? In French, which I believe the Turkish term for a strike is sort of derived from the French, right? Like, it also comes from Paris, where this place where workers would gather along the River Seine in order to sort of be hired for jobs, right? Like, and over time, a gathering place for workers became work stoppages. How, I do not know. I don't speak French, right? But in this language too, right? There's actually a sort of specifically maritime worker origin to the word for work stoppages, which then apparently jumped into Turkish language too, right? Dock work generally is called casual in English. Casual means you don't have a job tomorrow. Today you may have a job if the boss hires you to work a ship, loading or unloading cargo. But once you finish that job, maybe it's 8 hours, maybe it's 24 hours, you don't have another job until you get picked again. In other words, this is not permanent employment, this is casual, again in English. Now we sometimes use this word precarious, right, as a sort of de facto term to explain how this work is. By contrast, I have a contract and it renews every year. That's a permanent job. Right? And so it's not easy to get a job because say I'm the boss and there's 15 of you and I only have 5 jobs. And so rather than you being friends, you're now enemies of each other. Right? And as a result, you work for less. Right? Because if she works for $10, he's willing to work for $9, I pick him. Right? And it really doesn't matter that you happen to be buddies. It just matters that, so this is a so-called race to the bottom, right? Like where wages are driven down because of labor surplus, but also because of the nature of hiring. It's not unique to this industry. Right? If you get hired, the work is hard. It's very dangerous. I've said before, I mean, anytime you go to work, you might die. Right? Literally, accidents were common in this industry, partially because the work is tough, but partially because employers didn't invest in safety, right? And because they work you hard and fast, right? Why? Because again, in English, there is a saying called the ship must sail on time, right? Why? Because there's another saying in English, time is money, right? In transportation, not just in shipping, but also in other forms of transportation, you're paying for the labor based on how long they work, right? And so that is a lot of pressure, therefore workers would often be expected to work 12, 24, 36 hours, right? It also actually is a potential weakness, right? Because if you slow down, you're costing the employer money, and that's actually the only thing the employer cares about, right? Which gives you potential power, right, or leverage. These are not secrets. Many people in many places have figured these things out centuries ago, right? You know, and I should point out that I usually use the word dock worker in English, or docker in South Africa and England, but in the US often the term is longshoreman, along the shore is the origins of that term. But I prefer the gender neutral term dock worker. And now there are women in the industry, but it used to be that this was 100% male occupation, right? The presumption that women are weaker than men, although my partner can beat me up, right? So it's an all-male occupation. Now it is not. Containers actually change that. The technology actually opens up opportunities for women that maybe were less likely prior, right? And so we can talk about that if you want. The other last thing I'll say before I talk about the specific history, because you have to talk about the industry, is I already started to suggest that workers have potential power here. One thing is that even though you see each other as enemies in the hiring process, once you're hired, you work together. Right? No one can load and unload a ship by themselves. Historically, it might take 100 or 200 men to load or unload a ship. You work in gangs, often of 20 to 30, and often in pairs within those gangs, right? And so that means we need each other, right? Because I can't lift this by myself. Come on, Akin, help me here. Right? And so we would lift together. And also what happens, well, if this rope might collapse and something will follow me, maybe it's Alkan who will help me and not let me die. Right? He'll push me out of the way because he's watching as this basically load of cargo might break and sort of fall on my head, right? Or if I fall into the hold of the ship, who's going to help me, right? And so the nature of the work actually creates a collective identities in a way, and the employer is never a dock worker, and the dock worker is never the employer. No dock worker becomes the owner of a ship. Just doesn't happen. And so this notion of mobility that many of us think about in a capitalist society really does not exist in this industry. And so there's no notion that can relate to the boss. No, the boss is them and we are us, right? And there is a stark division between that, right? It's actually up through the 20th century legally in the United States, but in many countries, an employer could actually beat a worker in this industry. If you were on a ship's captain could physically punish an employee, right? And so there's no sympathy between bosses and workers, right, in this line of work, the way sometimes workers relate to and sort of aspire to be a boss. That's the case. Right? So that's sort of a lengthy but perhaps interesting and sort of introduction to the maritime world and the world of the waterfront, right? Now with that, well, I can talk a little about the specific cases I think are very interesting, including how in the Bay Area, San Francisco, and Durban, workers fight for racial equality, right? So the union that I've spent a lot of time getting to know in the United States is called the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. Historically, they had the word men in their name, but actually in the 1990s, they de-gendered their name. They voted to change their name to a gender-neutral term, which is very unusual in the United States. The other big union in this industry in the United States is still called the International Longshore Men's Association, even though there are women who work in this line. Right? And so the ILWU, but when it was founded in the 1930s, there was the word men was in their name, International Longshoremen's and Warehouses, led by an Australian immigrant named Harry Bridges, pictured there, who actually was part of an important legal Supreme Court case in the 1940s that now suddenly is relevant because the US government is seeking to deport people based on their ideas who have legal residency in the United States. And the US government tried to deport him for years. He was persecuted, and there's an important Supreme Court case that suddenly people are talking about with his name in it, Bridges versus Wixon, right? Because the government tried to get rid of him because he was considered a communist, even though he was not a communist. He was communist-ish. So that's important too. So in the 1930s, the time of the so-called Great Depression, this union and many other unions emerged from the ashes of the economy, right? In this union, became very powerful and still sort of the union. And well, I'm a teacher, right? Like maybe there's a few others in the room. I'm in the union. It's called the American Federation of Teachers. No one in my union at my university knows the history of their union, including who founded the union. In this Dockworkers union, even though Harry Bridges is dead for the last 30 years, everyone knows Harry Bridges. It's sort of amazing, right? Like, so they know their history better than my teachers' union knows the history of the profession of education. Right? Like, it's sort of amazing, right? Like, so Harry Bridges is still very much alive. When you, in a small group, if I say the word Harry, they know I'm referring to that man who's dead, right? Like, it's always very impressive to me. Right. He was an important figure, like I said, an Australian immigrant who moved to the U.S. after World War I, became a dock worker, he had been a sailor, right, and then became this leader who really led this union for 35 years. He was very much a leftist, if not a member of the Communist Party. And there were many others in his union. And so after the union won their initial strike, won raises, reduced their hours, they also took control of, in their negotiations with the employers, the hiring system. So they got rid of that system I described in which workers are played against each other by the employer. Instead, the employer, me, would call up the union hall and say, tomorrow I need 20 people at Pier whatever, right? And then the union picks who goes to work, right? You have to be a member of the union. And who within the union picks who is dispatched, who is assigned the work. Well, each year the union votes for one of their own, or actually multiple members who are dispatchers, to be in this position, who's paid by the union, right? Like, and then the union dispatches workers, right? And in this union, they also decided every time someone shows up for work, and I should point out that you still don't have to show up for work. If you're a member of the union, you don't want to go to work someday because you're tired or because you wanted to see your friend or your kids in school and sick or something, you don't go to work. Now, you don't get paid if you don't go to work, right? But you actually still don't have a guaranteed job, right? Like, but if there's enough work, right, you have work. And how do you get a job? You go to the union hall, and then you show up at a certain time, and then how do they pick among the members? Those workers who have worked the fewest amount of hours in that part of the year get the first job, right? And so those who have earned the least amount of money get the first opportunity if you show up that day, right? Like, and so, like, I'm not a Christian, but you could call that Christianity, actually, like the last shall be first, right? You could call it socialism too, right? Because they're not creating equal earnings, but they're creating equal opportunity, right? In some ways it is very unusual, but because very few other unions did this, right? Like, but it's indicative of this politics of this union when it was founded in the 1930s. And I should note that they controlled the entire West Coast, from San Diego up to Seattle was all the ports, but San Francisco was the most important. Now, also interesting, this union was committed to racial equality, right? Historically, most white Americans were not believers in racial equality, and historically, most unions were not committed to racial equality. In fact, unions often see sort of black people and immigrants as threats, right? Xenophobia is alive and well historically and contemporaneous, right? Like, and so this union was different. It was not unique. There were many other unions actually that started to shift in the 1930s in the US to start to become what I would call anti-racist, right? And this was one of them. So that when this man, Peerless Williams, arrived in 1942 into San Francisco and then found a job on the waterfront in 1944, he and others like him said, I cannot believe I've just entered a union that treats me equally. He called it a utopia, which is maybe an exaggeration, but nevertheless it's very impressive. And he said to me once, I knew him very late in his life, it might have been the first white people I ever met who weren't racist. Right? Now I thought to myself, well, they actually might be racist, but they act, in other words, who knows how someone thinks, right? But in their actions, they were anti-racist. Right? Like, and that's deeply impressive in the United States of America. And this union became very well known for fighting against racism, so that more and more black people wanted to get into this union, one, because you got paid, and two, because actually you got to treat it equally. So that by the 1960s, he had become the president of his local, right? And was very well known in his union subsequently. Now, in the U.S., among historians, we come up with, academics have terms for stuff, right? Like, this is called, in the U.S. context, civil rights unionism, right? So you combine civil rights, sort of fights for black equality, with unions, civil rights unionism, right? One of the many leaders within the union in the Bay Area was this guy, Bill Chester, who sort of fought, because there was not everyone in the union who believed in these things. They often had to fight internally to sort of convince some of their white fellow workers that this was as it should be, right? And they also then had to fight beyond the union too, but like these were struggles, right, that had to happen. I want to highlight that the San Francisco Bay Area local was particularly good when it came to racial equality. Other branches of the same union, not as good, right? Portland, you may or may not know anything about Portland, Oregon. Maybe you've heard of it, right? It's a smaller, big city on the West Coast. Has a reputation now as being super progressive. For somewhat good reason, right? Like, but there's a blind spot, you could say, which is that it's a long history of racism in that city, including in that local union, right? Like, and so what was happening in San Francisco wasn't exactly what was happening up in Portland, right? Like, even though it was in the same union, right? And that was somewhat problematic, but yeah, we're mindful that within this union, even there's sort of gradations of commitment to these matters. The last thing I'll say about this issue before transitioning to Durban is I'll just say that you might recognize some of these people. You probably would recognize their names. Nelson Mandela, pictured on the top left, with his then wife Winnie. Martin Luther King in a newspaper on top right. Bottom right, maybe not known, Paul Robeson, but one of the greatest black Americans in the history of the United States. I say if you've heard of Kanye West and Denzel Washington.
You know Paul Robeson.
Paul Robeson was the greatest singer and the greatest black actor of his generation. He was known worldwide, and he was a radical activist. Right? And he's basically, his career was destroyed in the 1950s, so that now many people have never heard of him, including in the US, even though he was a globally known figure in the 1930s and 1940s. And then Angela Davis, bottom left. These four people all have become honorary members of this little union. Right? Like, and I'm suggesting to you that there's no other union in the United States it's, that these four people like them would want to have become associated with, right? And so this is particularly impressive as we've seen. So Durban, this is sort of housing for dock workers who had to live near this, the port. Even though apartheid, which meant in Dutch or Afrikaans separate, right? And so apartheid meant legally racial separation, right? And cities in the 20th century were considered white spaces. If you were a black person in a city, you needed to have a reason to be there. And that reason was you worked for a white person. If you didn't have that, and you had to have a pass, you had to have this proven on paper, you could be arrested and deported to another part of the country, right? Like, so, but the only black people who were allowed to live in the city were dock workers, right? Because the ship must sail on time, right? And so they needed to have workers close to the harbor all the time to load and unload cargo, right? That's a photo from the 30s of Durban dockers. Now, Durban dockers were also casual in the same way that before the LWU was born, right? And that was sort of one of the many ways that dock workers were weak because the hiring system basically disempowers, right? But these dock workers were able to sort of figure out a way around this system in some, I would suggest, clever ways. If one of you doesn't show up for work, and I'm the hiring boss in Durban, it really doesn't matter because there's another 20 of you. But if you all, in that hostel, as they called it, the sort of that building I showed, decide no one's showing up for work tomorrow, you essentially have a strike, right? Legally, it's not a strike because you don't have a job, right? And so black workers didn't have the legal right to unionize or strike, but they could collectively organize to have the same effect, right, that you could strike, right, because they were able to coordinate. One, they worked together so they had a common identity. Two, most were of the same ethnic group, the Zulus, right? Three, they lived together. Four, I'd say they suffer together, right? Like, and so for all these reasons, they were able to actually form these powerful informal organizations, right? That repeatedly resulted in them basically striking, even though legally they couldn't strike, and even though legally they didn't call it a strike, right? But during World War II, well, South Africa's still allied with the British and the so-called Allies. What do black people in South Africa care about the fight in Europe or Asia? Like, who cares, right? Like, it's an opportunity to make more money because the British desperately needed Durban because it was a key point moving basically people and food from India to Britain, right? Like the Suez Canal wasn't happening at that time, right? Like so like they could take advantage of basically opportunities like huge demand for labor in order to improve their own conditions, right? Like, and then after the war in the 40s and 50s, they also continued to do this. They often basically there's at least 7 major strikes from 1942 to 1959 in Durban of dock workers, even though they don't have the right to strike, and even though they don't have a union, right? Now, by the late 1950s, they were coordinating these, what they referred to as stay-away, right? They used a different term, with the political organization called the African National Congress, the ANC, which was not the only, but was the most well-known and largest of the anti-apartheid organizations in South Africa then. There was a trade union arm, sort of, to the ANC called SACTU, the South African Congress of Trade Unions. Right? And so, like, dock workers in the late 50s were not only stopping work in order to get money, a raise, but they also were doing it because when workers, black workers, demonstrate power, that's implicitly a threat not just to their employer, but also to the entire racialized system of apartheid in South Africa. Right? I appreciate that that didn't give us a little dive into apartheid. If people want to talk about that, we can. But it's worth noting that in the post-World War II era, where much of the world was moving towards greater freedom, South Africa was actually moving in a direction where basically 85% of the people were suffering under sort of conditions that were very similar to Nazi Germany, minus the concentration camps. Right? But many South African whites believed in Nazi Germany's values, right, of racial supremacy, right, in the same sorts of ways. Right? Now, I'm also highlighting here that in the post-World War II era, many of the parts of Africa that had been colonies of especially Britain and France, but also Portugal, right, were starting to fight for liberation or independence or anti-colonialism, right? And that black workers in many of these struggles were very important, I should say, black transportation workers. So in Mombasa, which was the big port in East Africa, that was British East Africa, dock workers were also doing similar things to what I was just describing. In Portuguese West Africa, the photo on the right is like when a bunch of basically dock workers were killed by the Portuguese army, right, during a big strike in 1959, right? And so I'm also suggesting that what's happening in South Africa is happening in other parts of Africa and other parts of the world where the majority of the world's population is fighting for freedom from really European colonialism, right? And so that's an interesting sort of component to the work here. So much so that by 1959, that system of casual labor that I tried to describe was ended not by workers, like in San Francisco, but the employers actually de-casualize. They get rid of the shape-up and hire basically permanent dock workers because they go, we can't figure out a way to basically disempower these workers. We're going to make them all permanent employees, which is in some ways good, right? And so they actually demonstrated power because the employers got rid of a hiring system that rarely do employers want to get rid of a casual labor system, right? Because they usually benefit from it, right? The fact that it was the bosses who de-casualized the hiring system is evidence that they had a need to, right? Like, why change it if it's not broken, right? And so, like, anyway, that's sort of evidence of their power in a variety of ways. If you know your South African history, and many of us don't, I appreciate including the United States. No one knows anything about South Africa, right? So if you don't know a lot about South Africa, you're not alone, right? But in the 1960s, massive repression emerged by the state. Many people were killed. Many were arrested and imprisoned, including the most famous one, Nelson Mandela, right? Political parties were banned. Many went into exile. Some went underground. Right, like basically, there was approximately a decade where there was very little domestic opposition to apartheid, right, because of repression. Right? Repression works. We can know that, right? However, there was underground developments in the 1960s and early 1970s, including in Durban, including among dock workers, 2 of whom are pictured here, right? And many of whom were part of what was the emergence of a secret underground military organization that was a sort of an arm of the ANC that actually Mandela first helped create, but then he was imprisoned. And that organization in English was called Spear of the Nation, but in Zulu it's called Mponte Wesizwe, and this was their logo. Right? And if you pay attention to South African politics, now there's a new political organization called DA. Right? And so they're basically trying to, and some of them are veterans of that organization, because they have a lot of people respect them because they were doing what very few were willing to do in the 1960s and 70s, which was risk their lives by trying to overthrow the state through military means, even though actually they had no chance because the state had infinitely more power than this small group. Right? In many other African countries, they also had turned to armed struggle more successfully. Algeria, for example, right? But there really was no chance that they were going to overthrow apartheid through that means, but it's noteworthy that some were trying this. They had tried for 50 years to use nonviolent means, and that had failed. Right? So we could talk more about that. Dock workers continue to actually agitate, and so there's a number of strikes that happen in the late 60s and early 70s. Some of the only strikes in the entire countries of black people were of dock workers in Durban in the late 60s and early 70s. And then in something that's important in South Africa called the Durban strikes, in 1973, upwards of 100,000 workers went on strike across many industries over several months. And that is actually a pivotal event in the history of South Africa in basically reigniting domestic opposition to apartheid. I haven't mentioned it, but in Durban, there's a large South Asian or Indian population, right? There's actually a long history of tensions between blacks and Indians in South Africa. I would say fomented from whites, but nevertheless real. And it was noteworthy that not only black workers went on strike in '73, but also many Indians. And today, it's often said, I think it's true, but I don't have evidence, there are more Indians in Durban than there are in any other city outside of South Asia. Right? And so it remains a very interesting place. If you happen to be like me, a long-time vegan, it's the best place to eat in South Africa, right? Because Indian food is much more vegetarian friendly than most African food cultures and most food cultures for that matter. I won't say compared to Turkish food culture, but Indian food is really good for many of us, but especially for vegetarians, right? Like because Hindus are vegetarian. God bless. So I won't talk about containers, but if we want to talk about containers, I'm happy to talk about containers. It's very interesting. It is really important. It's actually the reason that many ports lose the work, so that some areas win and some areas lose, but San Francisco no longer is a port. All the work moved to Oakland. You might have heard of Oakland too, but it's actually where the harbor is, right? New York City no longer has a port. Right, all the work moved across the river to the Hudson River to New Jersey. London no longer is a port. Right, it's still on the river, but no container ships sail up the Thames River to get to London in order to. They all go, and maybe one person knows, but no one even knows what the big port. England is one of the most important economies in the world. Very few people even know the harbor that was created in the container era. That is actually where all ships come in and out of England. Right, and so anyway, that's interesting, and again, there's winners and losers, but it changes the nature of the industry in significant ways, which I won't say any more about. I'll try to be a little quicker here, but I also want to talk about how workers use their power, not just to improve their own lives, and not also to maybe change their own countries, but also how they can do similar things to help other people in other places, including in San Francisco, this photo I love, when workers stopped work in order to fight apartheid, even though they were 20,000 kilometers away. Right? So there's a long history among black people in seeing solidarity with other black people, even if you're not from the same country or place. One term for that is Pan-Africanism, pan sort of meaning across. Right, so both people throughout Africa, and of course all the countries in Africa were created by Europeans drawing lines on a map that had nothing to do with people in Africa. Right? But also Africans who were brought against their will to the Americas, who were enslaved, millions who ended up in countries like the United States, Cuba, or Brazil. Right? And so Pan-Africanism is a 20th century concept, 19th and 20th century, still exists. So that many black people sort of identify with each other. And many black people also have worked, black men, in shipping. So you might have heard of the French, a Senegalese filmmaker and writer named Ousmane Sembène, who's on the left. who actually worked as a dock worker in Marseille in France in the 1950s. You might have heard of the Jamaican Claude McKay, who lived in New York City, but who was an important writer, right, who also worked as a sailor. You might know that Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and black people in many parts of the world protested because they cared about what happened in Ethiopia. Right? And so there's examples of both black maritime traditions, but also black international political identities that I'm sort of noting is sort of an important part of this game. Right? Now, I think personally, but I know I'm not alone, that the struggle against apartheid is perhaps the most important social movement in the post-World War II world. Right? And if you're thinking about how do I sort of create a global movement to try to pressure a country to change, you might think about what did the South Africans do to create a global anti-apartheid movement, right? You might be thinking about the climate justice movement, you might be thinking about what's happening in Israel, right? Or any number of, but like, there's a blueprint here, right? And so if history has a use, right? This is one example of how we study the global struggle against apartheid. In the 19th century, it was really the struggle against Atlantic slavery was the largest multinational movement against injustice. Right? But in more recent times, it's really the sort of how many countries and peoples around the world said, South Africa, what they do is wrong, and we're going to sort of take a stand in some ways. Right? And so there's multiple components to that. You might say you want to get your government to get involved. You might go to the United Nations for better or worse. You might want to be a consumer who doesn't consume South African products. Right? You might not want to invest in companies that sort of work in South Africa. Right? You also might be a worker who has some ability to sort of exert pressure. Right? Even though many of us think more of boycotts as consumer-driven than worker-driven. Right? I'm suggesting to you that workers actually have even more power potentially than consumers. Even though when we use the word boycott in English, we often think of it from the perspective of what do I choose to buy. Right? Not that I'm opposed to consumer power either, right? But it's like playing the capitalist game, right? Where worker power is a whole other way to think about it, right? So the first time that in the United States workers said, I'm not going to touch cargo from South Africa was in San Francisco. Again, led by Bill Chester, in coordination with civil rights and anti-apartheid activists. They threw up a small picket line, photo on the right, in December of 1962. 20 old people. Led by a white woman in the middle, right? The 100 men behind them could have just walked through this line of protesters, and it wouldn't have really been difficult, right? No more difficult than us walking up the stairs here, right? However, rather than going to work, they had, of course, knew about this in advance. Like they said, we are going to respect this community protest, and we're not going to work this ship in solidarity with what's happening in South Africa. Technically, this was not a strike, but just like with those Durban Dockworkers, it doesn't really matter what word you use, the same effect, right? And so this ship didn't move. Cargo from South Africa was not unloaded because these people coordinated with what we would now call civil society. Right? After one day, they did then unload this ship. But so this is what you call a symbolic strike, and we could talk about that if you want. In the 1970s, after an event called the Soweto Student Uprising in 1976, which was actually another key moment in South Africa that the world started to pay attention, when young people, like 15-year-olds, started to protest against apartheid, right, outside of Johannesburg. A lot of people started to pay more attention, including the man on the right, Leo Robinson, who I got to know late in his life, who was another dock worker in San Francisco, who was an African-American from Oakland, decided to do something about what was happening in this place far away, and with comrades in his union, including these on the left from 1977. You could tell it's 1977 if you can see it closely based on their clothing and their hairstyles, right? Like that they started to sort of basically agitate within their union in solidarity with South Africa, but not just South Africa, but also Zimbabwe, which is just to the north of South Africa, but at that time was still called Rhodesia, which was a similar white minority country, but also in Mozambique, which was only recently becoming free from Portuguese colonialism, as well as Namibia, which at that time was actually controlled by South Africa, but then was called Southwest Africa. It had been German, but then was controlled by the South Africans for 60 years, right? And so these guys, who were all working longshoremen, right, started to educate themselves, educate other members of their union, hold meetings, not unlike this, with random groups of people in the San Francisco Bay Area and in other parts of California in order to raise awareness about why apartheid was bad and why people should organize against it. Right? They were not alone, they were part of a global movement, but they were within their union, right, doing this, as opposed to some other organization, right? So much so that at one of their meetings, where several hundred people would attend their monthly meetings, they showed a film, this film called The Basque at Dimbaza. Very hard to find, not very well known now, very cool movie. I actually, just a few weeks ago, passed by the town of Dimbaza, which is in a remote part of South Africa. But this film was secretly made in South Africa in 1973, smuggled out of the country, and then was shown thousands of times around the world. And so that in an hour you might say, oh, now I know what's going on in South Africa, because it was a teaching tool, right, like that. And the committee that I described showed this movie at their meeting, and then as planned, one of the members of the union got up and said, I move that the next ship that comes in, we don't work, right, that has South African cargo. Well, that photo on the right is the next ship that came in a few weeks later that had South African cargo. It was called the Ned Lloyd Kimberley. And then for the next 11 days, no one touched that ship. And it became a sort of a spark within the Bay Area to sort of grow the anti-apartheid movement, and was nationally known, not internationally known. Right? But this was an important moment in the US chapter of the anti-apartheid book. So much so that 6 years later, when Nelson Mandela was freed from prison and did his first global tour, he visited the United States, among other countries, in 1990 and afterwards, with his then wife Winnie. Right? He did a 10-day tour to the U.S. in June of 1990. I was in a university in New York City at that time. I didn't give a shit about what was going on in South Africa. I didn't know about it. It just wasn't part of my world, right? But he actually, I remember that moment because he spoke in New York City. He spoke at a big baseball stadium, Yankee Stadium, right? It would be like Fenerbahce, right? It was sold out, right? So I vaguely remember the fact that Mandela came to New York City, but it never occurred to me that I should go to this. So I think about this when I think about my students, and I want them to be more engaged. And I remember that I was not an engaged student myself, right? I wish I had. He then later spoke in Oakland. This flyer comes from that. I have this flyer now because I bought it on eBay. He spoke, and he spent 10% of his speech in Oakland before 60,000 people, saying thank you to the ILWU, to Local 10, to the Dockworkers, who 6 years ago demonstrated that they were on the front line of the struggle. Right? The only people he gave a shout out to in his long speech before an adoring crowd. Right, very impressive. The last thing I'll share with you before saying thank you is they do this stuff in Durban too, right? And so in 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected president, the first multiracial elections in the history of the country. Some people say democracy began then. Technically, South Africa was independent of Britain in 1910, but a lot of people basically date 1994 as like the beginning of an independent, free South Africa, right? Unions had been unbanned. A new union emerged in this transportation industry, SATAWU, South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, right, in 2000. 8 years later, just to the north of South Africa, Zimbabwe, which also had become free in 1980. Zimbabwe doesn't have a coast, right? Zimbabwe is landlocked. Right? That means that when Zimbabwe wants to import or export things, it has to ship things by truck or rail to Mozambique, Maputo, or more typically Durban. Right? And so Durban is very important to the economy of Zimbabwe. Right? Now Zimbabwe, after it had become independent in 1980, led by a young rebel named Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe gave a lot of support to the South African struggle. A lot of exiles lived there. Really, the ANC and other groups operated freely on the border country, right? I'm aware that there's imperfect parallels between, say, I don't know, that Syrians were able to operate basically in southern Turkey, even though they were fighting against Assad, right, in 2012, 2013, you know, similar, sort of, not the exact same, right? But like, Mugabe is president. By 2008, he's been president for 28 years, maybe 24 years too long, right? He was a dictator by that point, right? Like, he used his power, including the police and the military, to suppress opposition. I'm mindful of you know, what's happening in recent times here, right? Like, you know, the opposition was led by the labor movement, right? By a man named Morgan Tsvangirai, pictured in this flyer here, who was beaten up, actually, during the election cycle, right? What do you do if you're in South Africa? What do you do if you're in Durban, right? Well, in 2008, when this ship came in from China loaded with weapons that Robert Mugabe had ordered from China in order to use them to kill his own people, right? Because Zimbabwe actually had no enemies exterior to the country, right? The Durban Dockworkers refused to unload this ship of weapons and bullets and said, we are doing this because we know that Zimbabweans had helped us previously, and we are not going to let our fellow workers in Zimbabwe be killed because we simply went to work and unloaded this ship, right? That ship left Durban Harbor, wasn't unloaded in Mozambique either, or in Angola on the west coast. Mugabe still won that election, or at least was named president, right? Like, so it didn't change the history of Zimbabwe in the short term, right? But it was another example of how these workers had refused to sort of basically accept, right, that they didn't want to be sort of partners in crime, right? In the case of Zimbabwe, right? The last thing I'll say is that, you know, I'm mindful that, you know, there's a war going on just to the south of here in Israel, and that many of us, including in my country, think about sort of the suffering caused by the Israeli military on Palestine. Mindful also that the United States provides a lot of the weapons, right, for it. What could Americans do? Well, Americans could potentially not work ships, right, that are loading weapons for Israel. It's easy to say this. It's much harder to actually make happen. And I would say that actually the union I've talked about today in the United States in the past actually has refused to work Israeli-owned ships in 2010 and 2014 and 2021. There's an Israeli-owned shipping company called ZIM, Z-I-M. It's one of the largest shipping corporations in the world. Right? But during the current war, that has not occurred. There have been protests in the US against some of these actions. I'm mindful that it's not just the United States, that in Spain, actually, dock workers have announced that they've refused, and also in Italy, right, where there have been some ports that said we won't touch military cargo, right? I'm also mindful that in Morocco, they are, in fact, where Spain refused to handle US military equipment just south of Spain on the other side of the Straits of Gibraltar. Morocco, a country that's where most people might be sympathetic to the Palestinians, the state is having them go to work, right, like and the king there doesn't apparently be very sympathetic, right, like now's a nasty time, but if you're thinking about Israel right now, you're not alone. I get emails almost every week from people who are asking me my opinions, not that I know much, right, about this sorts of things, right, like, because what I talked about in other places, the same sorts of things exist, right, like, perhaps for more brave people. The last thing I'll say actually about that is, in South Africa, South Africans are very sympathetic to the Palestinians, right, in case you were unaware. South Africa actually brought the case before the International Courts of Justice to try to sort of condemn Israel. As a result, the United States has sort of expelled the South African ambassador, right, to the United States a few weeks ago. But people in South Africa, where I recently was, are united and sympathetic too, and they say actually what they see in Palestine is worse than what South Africans experienced in their own country, including the fact that South Africa's government never bombed civilian populations and killed tens of thousands of people in the case in the span of a few months. Right? So South Africans are thinking about this stuff too, right? Like, which is interesting. So I very much appreciate your attention. I apologize for the slight delay in starting, and I look forward to questions and comments if anyone has them. But even if you don't, I appreciate your attention. And thanks again to the people who helped organize this in the room, because I wouldn't be here without you guys.